It was never my plan to create a nonprofit that trains veterans to hunt neo-Nazis. After January 6th, I quit a contract job with an intelligence company I had been working with in the lead up to the insurrection, and I started my own business. I named it Sparvarius, after the American kestrel, North America's smallest raptor, which is about the size of a blue jay. It's a bright, beautiful bird that most people see without even realizing what it is. But it's a hunter, deadly, precise. And that was the kind of work that I wanted to do. Operate in plain sight, take out the vermin, and stay under the radar. The operation was supposed to be so small that no one would ever notice it. Frustrated by larger institutions supposedly working to fight disinformation, radicalization, and extremism, who generally have a bunch of researchers doing soul-crushing work only to have their reports used more for fundraising than for making a difference, I wanted to work alone. Having my own firm gave me the freedom to choose my own targets, to take on cases that mattered. But it also meant that I had to find clients who could pay the bills. Within a few months, I was bringing other veterans into the work. Guys like me, disillusioned, skilled, and hungry for a mission that actually meant something. By the end of that first year, one of our clients pitched something bigger, a training program, one that would give vets a new way to serve. We'd teach them open source intelligence skills. We'd build a team. We'd make an even bigger impact. It was my chief investigator who suggested naming it Task Force Butler after Smedley Butler. Butler was a man whose most important contributions to American democracy came after he took off the uniform. I would argue that he's one of our most important yet forgotten anti-fascist heroes. You see, the attempted fascist coup that we all witnessed on January 6, 2021, wasn't the first time that fascists tried to manipulate veterans into destroying American democracy with a plan to storm the Capitol. In the early 1930s, retired Marine Corps General Smedley Butler was approached by a group of wealthy businessmen. They had a proposition for him, that he would become the leader of a coup, a fascist figurehead. At the time, the Great Depression had taken a tremendous toll on World War I veterans. These veterans had been promised a bonus for every day that they spent fighting in the Great War, but that bonus wouldn't be realized until it was far too late, as their homes were lost and families were starving. The bonus army marched on Washington and camped out on the National Mall. They built a tent city. Veterans organizations came together to demand that the bonuses be paid when they were needed and not wait until some of these veterans and their families died of desperation and starvation. Major General Smedley Butler wasn't just a legendary Marine, the most decorated of his time, having twice been awarded the Medal of Honor. He was, in many ways, that generation's version of General Mattis, a universally respected veteran, a household name, one who was known for taking care of his troops and continuing his service beyond his time in the military. Though I have to say, in the last few years, Mattis has reminded me less and less of Smedley Butler, but we'll leave that one alone for now. Butler had rallied with the bonus army and had their complete trust and confidence. It wasn't just his support for the bonus payouts that earned him that respect. It was his character, his ability to talk about the complicated and sometimes contradictory nature of military service. The Wall Street tycoons who wanted to recruit Butler into the business plot wanted to take advantage of that trust, to take advantage of those bonus army veterans, their patriotism, their desperation, their anger. They were right there on the Capitol Mall. All they had to do was move in and occupy the buildings. The group behind this planned violent coup laid out their plans before him. Butler played along just long enough to expose them. He testified before Congress. He went to the public, and then nothing. No one was punished.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff, or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions.
No one went to jail. The story faded, and America went back to pretending everything was fine. Sound familiar? January 6th wasn't the first time fascists tried to use veterans to destroy democracy. It was an echo of a history that few are aware of. Smedley Butler inspires me not because he was perfect, but because he changed. Because he saw the system for what it was and chose to fight back. As a Quaker and Marine, he was a contradiction. But he didn't let guilt or shame paralyze him. He acted. Many know him just for his 1935 speech and book, War is a Racket. Looking back on his service, he realized that he had served in wars of conquest across Asia and Latin America, and that was not in service to our Constitution or our democracy. He overthrew governments, he put down rebellions, and he made the world safe for American corporate interests, for the same Wall Street fat cats who later tried to get him to end our constitutional republic. Butler dealt with this publicly, in spite of all of the threats. He had titans of industry who owned newspapers and radio networks trying to destroy him and his reputation. He described himself as having been a gangster for capitalism. He told the American people that he hadn't been fighting for democracy. He'd been fighting for profit and a few powerful corporations. That moment of reckoning, that crisis of conscience, is something that a lot of veterans go through. We come home and realize that the wars that we fought in weren't what we were sold when we signed up. That the people we hurt, whether intentionally or accidentally, through actions or inaction, weren't always the enemy, weren't deserving of what happened. Some of us realize that we were used. Some of us turn inward, angry at ourselves, and that is the fuel for depression. Others transform that regret into righteous anger, and they focus their efforts on making the world a better place. Butler inspires me and the team that I work with to fight. And that brings me to this episode. Jonathan Katz is a journalist, historian, and the author of Gangsters of Capitalism. To write it, he followed Butler's path around the globe. He visited the places where U.S. imperialism, enforced by Butler and the Marines, left deep scars. He connected the dots between past and present, between the empire that we built, the violence that we unleashed, and the blowback that we're living with now. I wanted to talk to him not just about history, but about the future. What does this moment look like through Butler's eyes as Trump revives the same gunboat diplomacy Butler once enforced? As Trump orders our military to bomb boats in the Caribbean, to seize oil tankers, and to enforce embargoes by sea and air? What are we repeating? And what happens if we don't change course? And what do we do now with these lessons of history? How do we turn this knowledge into action? We're not here to play defense. This is On Offense. Jonathan Katz, thanks for being with me. You are an author, a journalist, what I would describe as a historian. I don't know if you call yourself that, but your work has seemed to become more relevant over time. And I'm thinking particularly about a book that anybody who's followed me on social media usually sees in the background, and that's Gangsters of Capitalism. Which is a story about Smedley Butler, who I named one of my nonprofits, Task Force Butler Institute, after. So could you tell us what's going on in the Caribbean right now and why everything in your book that you wrote years ago seems to be relevant, growing more relevant every day?
Honestly, if somebody could tell me what's going on in the Caribbean, I would appreciate it. I trying to understand what is happening there is a puzzle, but it does seem to echo with a lot of the things that I wrote about in Gangsters and that I've been covering for years. including in the Caribbean. I used to be based in the Caribbean. I was the Associated Press bureau chief in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Before that, I was in the Dominican Republic. I also covered the drug war in Mexico, which ties into all of this. The short answer is that the United States is turning its foreign policy from a global foreign policy to a more hemispheric policy. At least that's what they're claiming that they're doing. That's what the Trump administration claims it has been doing for the last couple of weeks. And a lot of this has been focused, not all of it, but a lot of it has been focused on Venezuela, which is run by a regime that is considered unfriendly to the United States and that the United States considers unfriendly to it. It is a nominally left-wing government of Nicolas Maduro, who is the successor of Hugo Chavez, who was the, red shirt wearing sort of kind of aesthetically Marxist ruler of Venezuela who came to power in the late 90s and was there until he died in 2013. And the Venezuelans have sort of often thumbed their noses at the United States. They have made common cause with and allied with some U.S. adversaries, including Russia and Iran and China to some extent. And, for various reasons, different people in power in the United States for all that time have hated them for all of that and wanted to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. Trump seems to be vacillating between trying to start a war of regime change against Nicolas Maduro to try to replace him with a more U.S.-friendly or Trump-friendly right-wing government of some kind. There's various candidates out there who they might install. And also he somewhat pretextually and somewhat as its own thing has been going after drug runners, primarily in the Caribbean, although also in the Eastern Pacific, which should be noted is not the Caribbean. And actually Venezuela has no Pacific coast. But the reason why you would go after drug boats in the Eastern Pacific is because that's a much bigger route for drug traffickers than the Caribbean for the last couple decades. And in so doing, has just gone on a spree of just straight up capital murder. I mean, just unadulterated, just killing people in boats, no trial, no evidence, nothing, and then bragging about it. And in addition to all of that, there's an enormous troop buildup in the Caribbean. First of all, just off the coast of Venezuela, the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is the largest aircraft carrier in the Navy, it's the largest aircraft carrier in the world, has been idling off of it for a couple of weeks now with a whole carrier group. But there's a bunch of other things happening in the region as well, including building up pre-existing military bases that have been decommissioned in Puerto Rico, entering into modus vivendi agreements with the Dominican Republic and others in the region, which sort of looks like it could be leaning toward a war of regime change in Venezuela, or it's just a giant bluff, or a thing that we also know is happening is that in the Trump administration, there's a bunch of different competing factions that are vying with one another for influence and to drive the bus forward. So that's why I went at the beginning and said, if someone could tell me what's going on in the Caribbean, I would appreciate it, because it's incoherent and unclear where it's going. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is, as of the time we're recording this, yesterday, the United States seized an oil tanker, just straight up pirated an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela and bragged about it. And when they asked Trump what he was going to do with it, he was, I guess we'll take the oil. So yeah. We're also now literally Pirates of the Caribbean now as well. So that's
I mean, I laugh because it's absurd, but the the impacts of these are potentially going to be felt for generations. And I think that is one of the lessons of Smedley Butler and your book, Gangsters of Capitalism. You did a TikTok, or you probably done a few TikTok videos where you've been going through the table of contents. And I think in like January or February is when I first saw one of these videos, and you already had quite a few things checked off.
Yeah.
Have you checked off anything recently, or is the whole table of contents already got check marked next
Not
to
physically, but this was the copy that I was using. This is just a pencil, so I'll go through it. So this is the book. Let's see, where was I then? Because at that point, Trump was going after Greenland. He was talking about re-seizing the Panama Canal, which has that's a whole other history of U.S. piracy, because that was how we created the Republic of Panama, effectively. Panamanians don't like to say this, but as a shorthand, we created the Republic of Panama in order to dig a transoceanic canal, which is, by the way, how you would get from the Eastern Pacific to the Caribbean, although drug boats generally wouldn't be allowed to go through the canal. Although who knows? Who knows these days? It's crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had this was the I don't know if it'll show up in the camera, but this is where we were back at Guantanamo, because they were sending migrants to Guantanamo. Smedley Butler, just to fill people in. So Smedley Butler, this guy who we're talking about, was a Marine. He was born in 1881. He lied about his age. At the age of 16, he joined the Marines to fight in the war against Spain. This is generally known as the Spanish-American War, or the Spanish-Cuban-American War, or the Spanish-Cuban-Filipino-American War. And he was first deployed to Guantanamo, which the United States had just seized a couple weeks before, and has never come back since. And from there, he went to the Philippines, he went to China, and then all over Latin America. He fought in every war, invasion, occupation of the United States, participated in, with just one or two exceptions, from 1898 until the eve of World War II. The reason why he's such a fascinating character is because at the end of his life, he became an anti-war and anti-imperialist activist who denounced the things that he was doing. And I should mention, he was very highly promoted, highly awarded, twice the recipient of the Medal of Honor, and a whole shelf of other medals. At the time he retired, he was a major general, which was as high as Marines could go at that time. He was the second highest ranking Marine in the country, and had been a hair's breadth away from being the Marine Corps commandant. And he kind of threw all of that away, in a lot of ways, in order to be outspoken, to talk about the things that he and his Marines had done. And also, not incidentally, blew the whistle on a fascist coup to overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933.
We'll talk about that one a little later, and people should stick around for that.
Right. And so, so definitely, like, so the last chapter of Gangsters, America, each chapter's named for the place where things happen, basically, in the chapter. So that was already checked off, because we're already like witnessing the rise of fascism, basically the success of a business plot sort of thing. This is what the coup that Butler blew the whistle on was known. But I had already checked off Guantanamo, the Philippines, because Trump had been talking about annexing islands, which is maybe an idea that he hasn't given up entirely. Also unclear. He's so peripatetic. He's so driven by just like immediate passions, and then he gets distracted and forgets about it, but then remembers it again, and then who knows. The Panama Canal, talking about re-seizing it, basically reasserting U.S. imperialism over what was originally a U.S. imperialist project. The Dominican Republic, very important, because the Dominican Republic is a model for ending birthright citizenship. Just solely right of the soil birthright citizenship, which is something that Trump is really intensely trying to do. The Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, just agreed to take up that case to decide whether it is constitutional to ignore the Constitution, basically. Who knows? I have no idea.
Very clear amendment, if you ask me, but I'm not a lawyer,
clear.
so.
Super clear. It's like the plain meaning. If you want to be an originalist about it, the original intent, like it's all there. But who knows? It's possible. I mean, it's possible that they've just taken this in order to shoot it down. But it's also possible that they've taken this in order to let Mr. Trump do whatever he wants, which is most of what the Supreme Court's been doing recently. Haiti, I would also add in. I have 2 chapters on Haiti because the U.S. And Smedley Butler occupied Haiti from 1915 through 1934. Butler was there for the initial invasion and the first couple of years of the occupation. And Trump has been on about Haiti, Haitians, rounding up Haitians. You might remember that during the 2024 campaign, he repeated this racist slander that Haitians in Ohio were eating people's dogs and cats.
Springfield.
Springfield, Ohio. Just an absurdity, just a racist absurdity that he then picked up and ran with. But he has been targeting Haitians. He stripped Haitians of temporary protected status from deportation, claiming that Haiti is safe to go back to. Haiti has never been less safe in my lifetime or the lifetime of anyone living today, really. I mean, it is, which is another thing we could talk about. It's absurd. Yeah. It's just very clear that he just wants to just get Haitians and then also Somali people, specifically in Minnesota. Partially this has to do with his beef with Ilhan Omar. But it's also just like black immigrants to the United States. He just wants to just round up and dispose of root and branch. And this goes back to a lot of the ideas, the racist slanders that go back to the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which was where, by the way, for instance, Vodou, the Haitian religion, becomes voodoo in the American popular imagination. The zombie is a Haitian folk belief that gets imported and commercialized and then sort of turned around into being initially a symbol of resistance against slavery and imperialism, and it becomes another vehicle for racism.
Could you kind of help me understand how what's happening in Venezuela right now and the broader Latin America, all of these drug ships getting hit, while domestic policy is becoming ever more racist? Are these things reinforcing? Is ICE going out and hitting the streets and putting their hands on brown people? Is that creating a more permissive environment for very similar foreign policy?
It's all part of the same thing. It is all part, because it's all undergirded by the same logic, which is that everything is permissible done to the other, right? So, you hear this in rhetoric on the right, and this is very widespread rhetoric on the right these days, right? Because there was a lot of correct and ongoing criticism of ICE, the deportation regime, the mass deportation regime that Trump has embarked on, about them violating due process rights. And you also hear this with the boat strikes in the Caribbean, right? People saying correctly, where's the due process? Let's even stipulate that all of these boats have drugs on them. We don't know that for a fact. They haven't shown evidence, but let's even just stipulate that all of these guys are actually running drugs. Let's even pretend, because this is imaginary, that these boats are even capable, the boats that are where they are when they're struck are even technically capable of reaching the United States. They're not. They don't have that kind of range. And in order to get that kind of range and that kind of fuel and those number of engines on the boat, you wouldn't be able to carry a lot of cocaine anyway. Also, the Trump administration has ginned up a lot of consent for this by bringing up the specter of fentanyl, because fentanyl is a crisis in the United States. A lot of people know people who have lost their lives to overdoses on fentanyl or on fentanyl-laced other substances. And so people are very scared of it. And so Trump tried to tie Venezuela to fentanyl, and all these boats to fentanyl, but fentanyl doesn't come from South America. It doesn't come from Venezuela at all. Venezuela is not really a drug-producing country, and it's certainly not a fentanyl-producing country. So that's just completely made up. But he's but let's stipulate to all those things. Let's even just pretend, land of make believe, that each of these boats is just like loaded to the brim with fentanyl, and they're launching out of Puerto Cabello in Venezuela, and they're headed straight for Miami. Mm-hmm. You still have to give due process to anybody in those boats. You have to give them a trial, and under the U.S. legal regime that we have now, the system of laws that we have now, these wouldn't even be capital offenses. You can't be executed, even if you're found guilty of being like a major drug kingpin, such as Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who Trump also just pardoned.
So as you're talking about,
I went on some long digressions there, but just to bring it back. So all of these things have to do with due process, right? You can't just grab people, throw them out of the country without giving them due process. You can't just like kill people in the Caribbean without giving them due process. And one of the things that defenders of the Trump administration have been saying is, well, where is there's no due process for criminals. Where is the due process? Like they didn't use due process when they crossed the border. Drug runners don't use due process when they're running the drugs, which makes no sense. Yeah. Due process only goes to people who are accused of crimes. You're not if you're a law-abiding citizen who's just like walking down the sidewalk, you don't have due process unless you're accused of something. Like the whole point of due process is to give somebody the due process of law if they are accused of doing something, so that you can then adjudicate it and figure out if they've done it. And this is absurd on its face and laughable, except the place where they come together is it comes together under this sort of idea, and this also ties into birthright citizenship, that the Constitution and that effectively the law, morality, the U.S. government, all of that only applies to U.S. citizens. And it only applies to the U.S. citizens who, the people who are making these arguments, think deserve to be U.S. citizens and deserve to remain U.S. citizens. Everybody else is on their own. And everybody else, anything can be done to them. And this goes to, there's a lot of different formulations that you can look at. But in a lot of ways, this is at least reminiscent of the Italian fascist conception of, everything within the state, everything for the state, nothing against the state, and that you have the state is there, the polity, the people, the fatherland, and that everybody else outside of it, you can do anything you want to. And really, all of these are expressions of that sentiment.
As you were talking about the kind of the confusion, I'll call it confusion because for a lot of MAGA, I do think they're confused. The confusion between drug boats, generally speaking, and where cocaine is manufactured, where it's shipped through, how it's transported across international waters, and fentanyl, which people have in their life, whether you're a drug user or not. Like fentanyl has probably touched your life if you're listening to this podcast. Yeah. That kind of brings me back to a mindset that I'm familiar with because I was there in 2003 when I enlisted in the Army. I looked at Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party and Osama bin Laden, the Taliban, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. All of these things were basically synonymous in my mind. Now, I am someone who I guess has to learn things the extraordinarily hard way. So I joined the army, and and weeks before we deployed to Iraq for what was Operation Iraqi Freedom 3, back when they used to count because the numbers got so high they stopped doing that. When they came down and they said, oh, the reason for the war, weapons of mass destruction, was actually a lie. So when you go there, your orders are to stand down from searching for weapons of mass destruction. It was profoundly eye-opening to me to have the pretext for a war that I was about to participate in stripped from me just prior to actually going over there. So I had a year to think about the things that I believed, how I felt foolish, how I felt like I had been betrayed. And when I got home, most Americans had not had that experience. Yeah. Most Americans were still very distant from the war that I and my friends participated in. And I grew and remain, if I'm being totally honest, like quite fucking resentful. And even though I became part of the anti-war movement and started actively protesting the war in Iraq, I used to kind of get frustrated when people around me would be oversimplifying things and saying this is a war for oil. Mm-hmm. Because I had met the Iraqi people, I had formed real bonds with friendships with my interpreter, with people out in Sadr City, Baghdad, people I genuinely cared for. And there was so much going on. There really was democracy. I mean, it's not like Americans know it, but I got to watch people vote for the first time. And that was somewhat meaningful. It was very corrupted by all of the negative experiences, but it did mean something. And I think that idea has saved a lot of veterans' lives because they were able to justify what they went through and what they did because of that. Those little purple stains on Iraqis' fingers after they voted, that was incredibly meaningful. But now I see, as you just said, as of this recording, yesterday, Trump just pirated an oil tanker. Now I think that narrative of this is a war for oil is not oversimplifying things. That kind of is a major driver. Am I being too dismissive of how complicated the situation is, or do you think it's fair to say that the war that may be coming in Venezuela is a war for oil?
That's a very good question. Is a very well posed question there. I don't think it's necessarily too dismissive. One of the things about this, and this is true of Trumpism for the last 10 years, is it is this kaleidoscope of just this remix of things from America's past, America's imperial past, America's authoritarian past, all of our worst instincts, picked up, recombined, with some new technologies added, but really the motivations are largely the same. Mm-hmm. The reason why Smedley Butler called himself a racketeer for capitalism was because that he saw that he was basically the muscle man for ensuring capital flows and resource extraction. And at all of the places that he went, he, identified, a major resource that he was there to secure. Oil in China and Mexico, sugar in the Dominican Republic, banking in Haiti, which is a complicated history, but just know that like a lot of banking, especially specifically Citibank, which is still today Citibank, but back then it was the National City Bank of New York, was directly involved. And, in a sense, Iraq was about oil. Oil was a huge piece of it. Certainly oil is a huge piece of Venezuela. One of the things that is different about Venezuela 2025 and Iraq 2003 without prejudging whether there's actually going to be like a full-scale war or not, because, again, bluffing and preparing for war literally look the same, so it's hard to tell. But the Bush administration was very sensitive to criticisms that they were doing this in any way for oil. And it was because protesters were out in the streets saying no blood for oil. And this was a slogan that went back to Pappy Bush's first Gulf War in 1991, when we were getting Iraq out of Kuwait. Again, this was done in the name of democracy, or not democracy, because Kuwait's not a democracy, but like in the name of like national borders or something. And
not self-determination, but
not self-determination,
but countries.
I mean, you get into some political theory here, but like you sort of reading backward through the United Nations, which is a democratic style organization in that every country has a vote. Then you get non-democracies like Kuwait, which then kind of become democratic or can be squinted at and looked at as being democratic within that system as long as they're allies of the United States. So that's part of what's going on there. But all that is to say that, you know, there were so many clear business interests in Iraq, whether you're looking at Halliburton, KBR, all of the contracts that were there to be won, and of course the oil, right? And when Trump is running for president in 2016, pretending that he had been against the Iraq war from the beginning, which he had not, but pretending like he had, because he knew that it had become a very unpopular war and that he could gain a lot of political capital from saying out loud what people were coming to understand, that this had been a colossal mistake, and that it was a mistake that he could sort of, again, if you squint, you could kind of blame Hillary Clinton for, right? It wasn't her war, but she was a junior senator who voted for the authorization for military force that then ends up making the war quasi-legal under U.S. law. And so he could do that, right? And so he could come out and say, I was against it, and it was all for oil, and what I would have done differently if I had been there is I would have kept the oil. So now in Venezuela, you wouldn't expect him to shy away from a grubby pretense like resource extraction, because like he's Donald Trump. He's the apprentice. Like, it's all about business. It's all about taking stuff and taking stuff from other countries. And so, of course, he's not gonna shy away from that. And so basically you are having in Venezuela people saying the quiet part that they weren't willing to say, the Republicans weren't willing to say in 2003 out loud. That said, all of these things, and this is also true with all of the history that I go through looking at Smedley Butler's life. And the way I write that book, by the way, is I travel to each of the countries. So I'm sort of doing a past, present thing. So I'm also talking about the things that have happened since and the things that were happening at the moments at which I was visiting. Smedley Butler, he's a polemicist. He is just a great public speaker. He's somebody who, he can turn a phrase, war is a racket, still an amazing phrase. And he makes these very blunt and very direct and very jarring claims. We were only there for the oil. We were only there for the sugarcane. We were only there for the banks, etc. The reality is, even in all of those cases, these were much more complex operations with much more complex motivations than that. This is not to say that they are good. It's not to say like, well, there were good parts and bad parts, because they were all, especially in this period, and I think it's pretty clear whatever we're trying to do in Venezuela now, and also what we did in Iraq, are just all uniformly bad. But they're bad in a variety, and a more interesting variety of ways, in which you have different groups within the government, different factions that wanted different things, right? So in Iraq, you definitely had the oil folks, the people who just wanted the oil. You had the people who wanted revenge against Saddam Hussein. But Bush definitely, I think, very clearly wanted revenge against Saddam for having threatened his father, and kind of made his father look bad, because his father had decided not to go all the way to Baghdad in 91, and left Saddam in power. and then he ends up losing the election the next year, which he didn't lose because of that, but he had this very big bump of popularity as a war president, and then it kind of went away. And Bush and Bush kind of always, I think, sort of blamed Saddam for that. You also had, there was a very pro-Israel lobby. Again, it's way oversimplifying to say that we went to war in Iraq for Israel. I don't think that's the case at all. But Saddam had fired Scud missiles at Israel in 1991. He was very bellicose toward Israel, and getting him out of the way was considered, a good thing. You had the pro-democracy lobby, not in the sense of like being big ideological, like, populists who wanted, one man, one person, one vote all over the world, but in the idea that, sort of America's democratic system, and that sort of if you, again, like I was saying before, like looking at it through kind of this political theory lens, looking at it through the idea that sort of America's a democracy, the American orbit is democratic, and bringing more countries into that, and that through like this series of policies and procedures, specifically elections, that you could sort of make the rest of the world like America. You had a lot of people who were saying, we'll knock over Iraq, then we'll go to Syria, then we'll go to Iran. And I actually, I was based in the Middle East. Later in 2003, I was based in Jerusalem covering the Second Intifada. And I interviewed Richard Pearl. The Prince of Darkness was his nickname. He was a big policy wonk and major advisor to the Pentagon. And this was, probably September, October 2003. And he said, because at this point everybody thought the Iraq War was over and that we had won. And he was saying, he said to me on the record, I was working for the Associated Press at the time. He said to me on the record, Syria's next. We're going into Syria next. And you see a lot of these things happening in Venezuela. You certainly have the resource extraction piece of it. Trump is personally a big part of that. That part is represented primarily by Richard Grenell, who's one of his advisors, who he has been sending. He had dispatched to Caracas, to the capital of Venezuela, to negotiate with Maduro, try to get oil for the United States. One of the possible outcomes of this is that Maduro says, okay, I'm going to stop selling oil to Iran. I'm going to stop, trading with China. I'm going to give preferential treatment to my oil market to the United States. I have a hard time imagining him doing that, but maybe. And that's one out that Trump might have out there. You also have the Marco Rubio faction. Marco Rubio, of course, the Secretary of State. He comes from a much more ideological standpoint. He's Cuban American.
That's the strong anti-socialism, strong anti-communism.
Exactly. And he kind of has a Richard Pearl vision. He was a neocon back in the Iraq War era, and I think still attitudinally is, more or less. And he shared, I think, this kind of perverse Straussian opposite of Trotskyite view of we're going to export revolution, but it's going to be capitalist and authoritarian, capitalist revolution. And he's Cuban American. He often poses as somebody whose family fled Castro. They didn't. His parents actually left Cuba before Castro came to power. So technically they weren't really fleeing Batista, who was the U.S. supported dictator, but they were leaving Cuba in that time. But he kind of grew up in that Miami milieu. And for those who don't know, the Miami Cuban anti-Castro politics are really extreme, and they have been pushing, since 1960 to violently overthrow the Communist Party of Cuba, which wasn't the Communist Party in 1960, but regardless, and install a capitalist U.S. friendly regime. And that is where he comes from. And his view, and he's not really shy about it, is that they'll go after Venezuela, they'll get rid of Maduro, that will be the easiest one. which is absurd. It won't be easy at all. But in sort of that 2003, it'll be a cakewalk sort of idea. We'll knock over Venezuela, then we'll go to Nicaragua, which is also a chapter of Gangsters, and we'll take out Daniel Ortega, who is a Sandinista, although he has gone through an enormous ideological transformation himself. But back in the 70s and the 80s, he was part of a leftist. There were Marxist elements of the Sandinistas who overthrew the U.S.-supported Somoza dictatorship there, and that we'll sort of get revenge on them. So we'll get revenge, for Jimenez in Nicaragua, in Venezuela. We'll get revenge for the Somozas in Nicaragua, and then we'll get revenge for Fulgencio Batista, the U.S.-supported dictator of Cuba, and then all of the pro-capitalist, now make the Western Hemisphere great again. Dictators will join hands at Foggy Bottom and sing. That's Marco Rubio's idea, and those are and I think part of the reason it's important to understand. And then you also have the drug idea, and I think also that one's very popular with Trump. Because he has his own weird relationship with substances. His brother was an alcoholic. He's kind of a teetotaler. He grew up in the 80s. Not grew up, but like he was an adult. He was going through like the prime of his life in the 80s, surrounded by people who were just doing mountains of cocaine. It was everywhere. It's still everywhere, and I'm sure it's in the White House and the Pentagon as well. But not in the Oval Office. I think it's fair to say.
Unless Don Jr.'s there, then I think it probably is.
It's on his gums. I don't know if he's allowed to bring it. Maybe we should cut that. I don't know. Anyway, that's a joke. That's satire. I think the drug piece of it is also very powerful for him. It's also powerful because, and this goes back again through all of these periods that we're talking about, they keep using this term narco-terrorism, which is really powerful, again, for two different reasons. One is because it gets the word terrorism in there, right? And by doing that, you can then authorize all kinds of things. We already took the authorization for the use of military force against Al-Qaeda and stretched it to cover ISIS and all these anti-Al-Qaeda groups and all these others and Boko Haram and just like anybody who like had any kind of vaguely Muslim sounding they were Muslim and they were involved in violence. We sort of like stretched it to that. Stretching it to like drug runners in the Western Hemisphere, I don't think. Who knows? I doubt that even like the most hardcore would, but I certainly like John Yoo, who was the author of the infamous torture memo. He's come out under George W. Bush. He's come out attacking the Trump administration, saying you can't just blow up boats. There's a law, man. So even like the John Yoos of the world are like this is not the same thing, but. In terms of popular opinion, getting that word terrorism there is a way to harness that. And you also see that in the rhetoric that drugs are chemical weapons and that they are effectively weapons of mass destruction, and that and they're trying to pull that in. The other piece of it is the term narco-terrorism itself has its origins in the 1980s. Actually comes out of Peru in that government's fight against Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, which is a Maoist guerrilla movement. But it gets adopted by the Reagan administration basically as a way of accusing Cuba, Nicaragua in particular, of participation in the drug trade, and then trying to use popular sentiment against the rise of crack cocaine in the United States, as well as powder cocaine. There was some moralizing going on in the States at the time. Nancy Reagan, the first lady, is doing Just Say No. DARE comes out of this era, and it's a way to sort of harness all of that energy against like, I don't want my kids to do drugs. I'm worried about the effects of drugs on my community, blaming a foreigner for it and saying it's these guys who are ideological enemies of the United States who are responsible for these things that are happening in your neighborhood, putting it all together and then trying to mobilize people against it. None of which was true at the time, by the way, either. Like the Cubans and the Nicaraguans weren't responsible for it. It was U.S. If anyone in Central America was responsible for it, it was American allies, including CIA assets, the Contras, the people fighting against the Sandinistas and things like this. But all that is to say that by looking at it in these much more complex ways, you understand, first of all, all of the different motivations, and in a lot of ways, the more motivations you have, the stickier something gets, and the more likely it is to be seen through to completion. You also then get to notice the frictions within the coalition, because this also happened in Iraq. Like the pro-democracy faction and the let's grab the oil faction and the let's just kill Saddam faction had. And the Let's Help Israel faction, they all had their own. Sometimes their oars were going in the same direction, and sometimes they weren't. And some of the things that happened in Iraq happened as a result of those frictions. And I think, again, part of the confusion that we're seeing in the Caribbean and in Venezuela right now with U.S. foreign policy is seeing the frictions between these different silos within what is effectively just a giant, pro-aggression caucus, but they have different ways of getting there. And again, you can take the oil without doing a war of regime change, but you can't change the regime without a war of regime change. And so there's a lot of friction, for instance, between the Grenell and the Rubio factions.
So one of the things that worries me, and I am a threat analyst, and I am scarily good at predicting bad things, both from like not quite individual attacks, but the dates or times that something like an assassination or a political assassination, like if you study these things enough, you can start to see things coming, like the attempted assassinations of Donald Trump. Like you see it bubbling up on the fringes. When it comes to global policy, I don't have enough experience to predict when a war is going to start. But I do think somewhere in the middle, I am starting to get a sense when it comes to domestic policy that phrases in terms like narco-terrorists and the way that narco-terrorists are being assassinated or murdered overseas is going to start to homogenize with domestic terrorists, of which Antifa is a focus. Pam Bondi recently, on December 4th, issued a memo to all U.S. prosecutors, to the DOJ, FBI, all the investigative agencies, to start pursuing not only tax crimes, but a long list of crimes against Antifa for what they describe as radical views on things like immigration and open border policy. With those specific things, immigration and open border policy named in that memo, I think that they are trying to establish a legal argument for extrajudicial killings within the United States. Now, I don't think that necessarily means SEAL Team 6 kicking down my door and shooting me in my bed. But I do think that it does create a pathway from DHS putting C4 on an immigrant's door, which they're doing now, to breach and get inside and grab people who aren't even criminals, or certainly aren't convicted of anything violent, and using those kinds of breaching methods in a way that is likely to cause harm or kill people. Do you see things kind of going in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, another piece of a justification for the military posture toward Venezuela, if not the full-on start of a war, is that a lot of the things that the Trump administration has had the court system put the brakes on, and of course they've been able to get the Supreme Court mostly off the shadow docket, so not actually like hearing the cases, but just sort of issuing these per curiam, 6-3 decisions, saying that the district court injunction against a policy has to pause while it's being decided on the merits or whatever. But insofar as the lower federal courts have been able to put the brakes on some of this stuff, a lot of it is because we're not at war, and Trump has been trying to use wartime authority to do stuff. When he declared Tren de Aragua a foreign terrorist organization, and tried to invoke the Aliens Act in order to affect that piece of the mass deportation, the courts said, well, there's no war, like you can't do this. And they were trying to make the claim that but isn't immigration sort of an invasion, and isn't an invasion sort of a war? And the courts were like, no. But you know what is a war? A war. If we go to war with Venezuela, then and this may be part of the motivation for doing so. Again, I don't think it's the primary motivation, but is another sort of tick in the favor of more aggressive military action. If you have a war overseas, then you can do things at home, like invoke the Alien Act, perhaps the Insurrection Act, which Trump has been really eager to do. Also, a war is going to provoke more concerted protests. There'll be anti-war protests, people going out into the streets. There'll be a lot of people. You may see growing dissent in the military. All of this could then become a pretext for doing all these things that the Trump administration wanted to do anyway. Because historically, in American history, when there's a war, civil liberties are curtailed, and and part of the reason why they become curtailed is, first of all, because there's often, not always, but often more public opinion, sort of a rally around the flag effect, where people are like, well, what are you, pro-German? Are you pro-Afghan? Are you pro-Iraqi? Yep. Were you cheering when the towers came down? If you don't take your shoes off at the airport, if you don't let the government, spy on your emails and your phone, if you complain about all of these things, then you're just going to let the terrorists win. Then you're going to let the Germans win. Then you're going to let the British, whatever the war was. And those are all motivations. And I think that, I think those things kind of go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. But I could totally see. I mean, and this is what I was talking about before, is that this idea of there's a concept that we're sort of talking around here, known as the imperial boomerang. Blowback. Which is, it's written about Frantz Fanon, the philosopher, theorist, psychologist, revolutionary, wrote about it. Hannah Arendt wrote about it. Albert Memmi wrote about it. There's a lot of different people with oftentimes very conflicting politics on some key issues. But what all of them noted was that imperial practices done to people out there end up brutalizing the colonizer, as Aimé Césaire said. They coarsen people, and they convince people. And I know this is a part of your experience, Kris. People who were had a gun put in their hand and were gone out and told, kill these Iraqis, kill these Afghans. They're not like you. They hate you for your freedom. And then they do these things. They suffer moral injury from it. They sort of have to make their peace with it in different ways. Sometimes they make their peace by being proud of having been part of an election, but sometimes they make their peace by saying, well, the people who I killed deserved it. They come home, and now they have a gun in their hand, either as part of a far-right movement or a far-right movement that is now running the government and the military of the United States. Similar gun in their hand, and they're out on the streets, and they're told, this guy hates you for your freedom or your Christianity or they want to bring in these threats from outside. They want the borders to be open. They're trying to bring in immigrants to destroy the character of the United States and steal elections and do all these things. Go get them. Go kill them. And then they're more primed to do that. And again, this is known as the imperial boomerang. And so, kind of what we're seeing is this accelerating feedback cycle in real time, where instead of just being, the German Empire went out and did these horrible things in Africa, in Namibia, in Tanzania, and then they came back and brought some of those things to the continent, and then their experiences in World War I, and then they started doing it to people in Germany. Now we're seeing it happen in real time, where people are just, there's this constant loop of people going overseas, doing things, coming back, going overseas, doing things, coming back, shooting the boats, and then shooting people in the neighborhoods. Looking at the open border. It's never been an open border, but like looking at the border and imagining these threats coming in from the outside. We have to stop them. Oh, those threats are already here. These are foreigners here. The libs love the foreigners. They're basically foreigners themselves, and it all just ends up getting mixed together.
Most people have been asking me, because I am a vet, because I came out of the veteran advocacy space and first started my career as a researcher, as an amateur researcher, studying foreign threats against American troops and veterans, spreading things like disinformation that would cause harmful belief systems. It's not simply fooling people; it's causing them to make their lives and the lives of others worse because they believe in conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement conspiracy, the anti-Jewish conspiracy theory that there is a cabal that is physically replacing white people with black and brown people to make a more compliant United States, right? That is what people are more susceptible to if they are surrounded by disinformation. It's also what they're susceptible to if they're just surrounded by hate. And I have seen guys that I deployed with go down the two paths that you're kind of talking about with moral injury, of I don't know if repenting is the right word, but certainly regretting it. And often that is anger that is turned inward, and it manifests for many people, and it did for me, as depression, like just crippling depression. I find that the guys who think that they transitioned out of the military very successfully are the ones who go on to become sheriffs, are the ones who go on to join DHS. I can think of one guy who became a sheriff, and he was an abusive personality in the Army. He can no longer be a sheriff because he did some really fucked up things with people that he was had detained. And we were at war long enough, for 20 years, that there is an incredibly large pool of veterans who, have gone down that worst path, which is a small percentage compared to the overall population. But we've also existed in a time where 20 years of that shit was normalized. All of these like veteran cool guy branded stuff, everything from Black Rifle Coffee, which became associated with like Kyle Rittenhouse and his extrajudicial murders, of a conflict that he provoked and then killed people, to 9-line shirts and grunt style shirts that became affiliated with MMA, where white supremacists have really been successful in spreading their ideology. The imperial boomerang that you're talking about is not just something that impacts the participants, but it impacts the witnesses. And I mean witnesses, the little boys playing Call of Duty their entire childhood and looking to all of the toxic manosphere stuff that, we talk about so much, and having that inform what is good and what is just. So all of that, it is the world that we live in. We don't have a choice. But the name of the show is On Offense. The idea behind this show is to get people away from a defensive posture of defending democracy and defending civil rights, and instead expanding, going on offense, imposing costs on the opposition, the political opposition, within the bounds of the law. Want to make sure I underline that caveat. Can you think of any way that people can go on offense in a way that impacts international politics and war? Is that achievable?
I mean, certainly, protest movements at enough scale and enough volume, they do have an impact. Obviously, there was an enormous protest movement at the outset of the Iraq War that did not stop the Iraq War from happening. But playing a little bit more of a long game, I mean, I think, eventually there was, there is a society-wide recognition that the Iraq War was a catastrophic mistake. It is not, I have a newsletter called The Racket, named for Smedley Butler. And I wrote a piece, I think on the 20th anniversary of the war, called The Wrongest War. And it was all about how everybody sort of agrees that the war was wrong, but can't come to a consensus about why. This is maybe a little bit more of an intellectual wonky sort of answer of a thing that people can do to go on offense, because it's the sort of work that I do. But actually trying to bring analysis and actually come up with answers, because when you cede the ground to, for instance, white supremacists have their answer for why Iraq went wrong. It's a variety of answers. It tends to be either we weren't brutal enough, we didn't just go and kill all of them, or it was I talked about the Israel threat of it, right? And they go for that, and they dispose of all the rest of it, and they say it was a war for Israel. It was the Jews got us into this war, and so if you don't want to have wars like that again, get rid of the Jews. That's basically their answer. And the way to go on offense is to come up with better answers, because those answers aren't right. Those answers don't make any sense. 1 million Iraqis died. It would have been very hard to be more brutal. I don't know what that even would mean, unless you just killed everyone in Iraq and then you rule over the ashes, which is that's been Israel's effective mode in Gaza since 2023. But that's not a good one, and I don't think it never ends up turning out well, because all you end up doing is making more enemies. And one of the things, going back to Butler's era and the period that I'm talking about, before, during, and after World War I, is it created a ton of resistance. And the more brutal that they were, the worse it was. In a lot of ways, the things that we're seeing right now, I mean, just with regard to Venezuela, why does Venezuela turn to China? Why do they turn to Russia? Why do they turn to Iran? It's because those are countries, especially China and Iran, that have a very long history, of being on the receiving end of U.S. imperialism, and they feel they can make common cause over it. Doesn't mean that they're good people. Doesn't mean that doesn't mean that they then turn around and treat their own citizens and their own people well, or share power, or do things that are good and moral. But it gives them a place to stand. And then what it means is that even people who oppose those regimes in those countries are much more loath to say, well, let's also be nice to the Americans, because they're like, well, the Americans are terrible, and the leader of my country you're just as bad. Things like this. This is known as blowback, right? In a lot of ways, 9/11 was blowback for U.S. imperialism. So the idea that more violence in the exterior is going to cash out in more safety at home is just false. And also, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, they're lunatic. They're not just. It's not just bad because oh, it's not a nice thing to say, and oh, people will get hurt if you talk that way. They're simply not true. They're fundamentally not true. The analytics aren't there. The idea that, AIPAC got us into, the Iraq War or drives all U.S. foreign policy everywhere in the world is absurd. It's not true. And what it does is it blinds people intentionally in a lot of cases to the actual dynamics that are at play. I mean, there's a reason why anti-Semitism was nicknamed the socialism of fools, because it is because people who are put upon, disadvantaged, suffer from wealth inequality and poor standards of living, and don't have the lives that they want and deserve, instead of coming together and organizing and figuring out ways to improve their station in life and make life more equitable for everybody, they're just given this other group of people. Obviously in anti-Semitism, it's the Jews, and that's what white nationalists often come back to. But it's not only the Jews. You see this kind of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic thinking. Again, we're talking about the Great Replacement toward immigrants. I mean, we're seeing it right now, this week towards Somalis in Minnesota. So you have people in Minnesota who don't have health care. They don't have, good food. Their kids aren't getting the kind of education that they need. They're not getting the kind of pay they deserve. All of these different things. They're living under the ravages of increasingly pernicious climate change with no end in sight. And instead of being given, these playbooks to say, look, use analysis, look and see, like, who has the money in your community. It's billionaires. It's this rapacious regime in Washington that's trying to harm you by making your life worse, so that you become more deeply, more malleable, and more easy to indoctrinate in their ideas. Instead, they're given these outgroups to target. They're like, it's the Somalis' fault. It's the Jews' fault. It's the Haitians' fault. Whatever. It's the wrong target. It's, again, I think what the white nationalists want, what the Nazis want, is they want for people to think that the reason why it's not okay to talk about what the Jews are doing to you is because the Jews don't like it, or because it's really impolite and it hurts their feelings, and it's facts over feelings. And the way to go on offense against that is like, no, those aren't facts. That's not how anything works. The Somalis aren't taking things from you. It's just, open your eyes. It's not these people who are just trying to live their lives and open businesses and go to school and they're just like you. And actually, they are your allies. They're the people who are living the kind of things that you're living, and you can come together and find ways to make your communities better together. And instead, you're being set against one another by these power-hungry individuals who just want us to be at loggerheads to take advantage.
One of the things that I think that people keep coming to me about, particularly because of the name of my nonprofit, Task Force Butler, and my other nonprofit, Veterans Fighting Fascism, is folks who've heard about the Wall Street plot, where a bunch of actual fascists who were corporate industry leaders in the 1930s tried to recruit Major General Smedley Butler, U.S. Marine Corps retired, into being the fascist figurehead, who was trying to manipulate veterans who thousands of them had come to Washington, D.C. to protest, to get the bonuses that they were promised for every day that they served in World War I. But wouldn't mature according to law for some time. And people keep asking me, where are the generals? Like, they're expecting a Smedley Butler-like figure to rise, and very specifically, and I think I've been guilty of thinking of entertaining this fantasy that James Mattis is going to drop down from the sky and lead a movement. Is that even possible? With all of these former generals today, James Mattis included. Now I'm not looking at his LinkedIn. I don't know who he's tied to, but I'm absolutely certain he's on quite a few corporate boards. Do you think that there is anyone out there who embodies Smedley Butler today? Or do you think that the corporate interests that are driving so much of both this fascist domestic and foreign policy, that they're just two in the pocket?
I don't think that is. I think that trying to look for a replay of history that's that exact is unrealistic. The conditions that led to Smedley Butler coming out and blowing the whistle on the Wall Street coup, the business plot, were very specific because, as you said, this point man for the businessmen, the guy who approached Butler was named Gerald C. McGuire. He was a bond salesman, Navy veteran, and he worked for Grayson Mallet Provost Murphy, who was a big financier on Wall Street who had a lot of intelligence background. He had worked for Army intelligence. He had been in the Philippines. He had been in Panama. He was in Europe during World War I, running the Red Cross, and after the war, basically set up a private intelligence network with Wild Bill Donovan, who's one of the founders of the OSS, which is in turn one of the forerunners of the CIA. And Murphy was also, I was able to put together in my book that Murphy, in addition to having this background, which I think had gone way underreported in accounts of the business plot, he was also the treasurer of this group, the American Liberty League, which was basically a businessmen's association founded by the DuPont brothers of DuPont Chemical, but had on as its members the heads of General Motors, General Foods, Sun Oil, Phillips Oil, a whole bunch of different industries, as well as some important bourbon Democrat, anti-New Deal, like conservative Democrat politicians, Al Smith and John W. Davis in particular. And names that people don't know now, but were big names at the time. What all that is to say is that Butler was in a position to blow the whistle on this because he was personally recruited for it. And instead of going along with it, reported it to Congress. He ratted them out. There were no consequences suffered by anyone in this plot. Grayson Murphy wasn't even called to testify in front of the committee because the committee said that they already had him, cold, which made no sense. That doesn't make any sense. And none of the big business names who Butler, connects with the plot were ever called to testify at all. Their names were mentioned in the press. But even, there's no evidence that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the target of this plot to overthrow him, ever called for them to be held responsible in any way. And there's a lot to talk about there. My short answer is that maybe simply by blowing the whistle on this, that was enough to keep it from happening. And also FDR, was working on these people for various reasons. A lot of them were connected to JP Morgan Company. They had a lot of money on their own, and he needed them for, various things. And maybe to some extent, he felt that having been sort of called out in public like this was enough, and that maybe it would, temper their desire to try to overthrow him. And maybe they would, give him a little bit more berth to work on his New Deal projects, a little bit less encumbered. in a lot of ways, what this reminds me of in terms of recent history, John Kelly, who was Trump's chief of staff, right, in the first term, came out in an interview, I think, with the New York Times, late election cycle in 2024, and said Trump is a fascist. Kelly, is somebody who, I mean, Butler was, I think, pretty clearly a leftist, especially by the end of his career. He was very interested in, social projects. He was proposing something that was basically Social Security in 1932 when he mounted a failed run for U.S. Senate. And FDR didn't even come around to proposing Social Security for several years after that. So in a lot of ways, he was very pro-labor. He wasn't a socialist. He certainly wasn't a communist, but like he was somebody who I think was broadly on the left. Kelly's not at all. But he is a little bit like Butler-like in that he, had this, big imperial past, lost a son, I believe, in Afghanistan. And, he comes out, sort of in similar fashion, kind of puts his name on the line, uses the F word with Trump, which throughout Trump's first term and really most of the 2020 and 2024 election campaigns, this was considered something that was not said in polite company. This was reserved for weirdos like me with newsletters. Like this was not something that like, you really talked about on the pages of the New York Times. And he says, the guy's a fascist, and no one cares. And Butler didn't do much more than that. All Butler did was he testified in front of Congress. Then he went home to his house in Newtown Square outside of Philadelphia, recorded a newsreel of himself in his office in front of a Marine Corps flag, saying, "This is what I told the committee," and that's basically it. Like he didn't really infiltrate. I mean, they came to him, and he kind of let it play out. Just long enough to sort of get Murphy to tell him what the plan was, but he didn't go farther than that. He didn't do great investigative work. I think, Kris, if you had been around in 34 and they had approached you, you would have been in the meetings. You would have taken more copious notes. You would have gotten photographic evidence. Butler didn't do any of that. Basically, all he did was he came out in public and said fascist. He said American fascists. And trying to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt, and that was it. And in a lot of ways, Kelly did the same thing, except no one cared. No one cared, and I don't exactly know why. I think maybe we are so sort of negatively polarized in these days, and we are just sort of nothing like that. I think maybe can shock us, and also we're just sort of like, oh, well, yeah, anyone who's against a presidential candidate is going to say, crazy things about them. Of course, people who don't want Trump to be president are going to say that he's a fascist, and people who don't want Harris to be president are going to say she's a communist, and you can just sort of ignore both of them. The fact that he was Trump's ex-chief of staff, what? That should have, for Trump supporters, you would think that would have raised alarm bells. But these are, you were talking about disinformation and low information. They don't care. They don't know what a chief of staff is. They don't care. They didn't these are people who in most cases I don't even think watch The West Wing. You can't even be like, he's like that character. They're just to them, Trump is a reality star. It's all about just sort of who looks good on television and who's saying the things that they want to hear said. And as soon as somebody turns on him, as soon as Marjorie Taylor Greene says, I think this guy might be a bad guy. I think, believe it or not, I think this guy may kind of have it out for people, especially women. And he might not actually be on the side of survivors of sexual abuse. And then she comes out, and then like all the Trump faithful are just sort of like, we never liked her anyway. She was always terrible.
Yeah, which
like,
is crazy. Yeah.
So in that environment, like having John Kelly do this, but like having anybody do kind of what Smedley Butler did, whether or not even that was effective when Smedley Butler did it, it's not. I don't know what could turn. I mean, the one thing I know, I'm rambling, and hopefully the editor will take care of all this. But like the one thing that I want to say, is that like you never know what's going to do it, and we haven't really talked about Epstein, and it's a huge rabbit hole that we don't need to go down. But the thing that's interesting about Epstein is that it is the one thing that has really gotten the attention of that hardcore, 30%
conspiratorial.
Of the country. Yeah. Just ride or die with Donald Trump. That's the one thing that they have been like, this guy might not be on the up and up. And so it's less who is a Smedley Butler and more what is that thing going to be. And then going back to the theme of the podcast, you then have to like get into those spaces. You have to get into that dialogue and replace it with something else, because your Nick Fuenteses, your Proud Boys, your Patriot Fronts, they're out there. They don't mind. Nick Fuentes doesn't care at all if Trump gets taken down by Epstein. That doesn't make a difference to him, because that then, as far as he's concerned, opens up a space that he can then fill and then say, well, yeah, Trump was a failure just like the Iraq War was a failure. But the problem was Epstein. The problem was that he was too close to the Jews. The problem was he was too close to Israel. I'm going to fix that by getting in. And again, you have to disrupt that, and you have to replace that bad information with good information and show people that no, like these things are going back to big historical ravages of capitalism and imperialism and racism and white supremacy that have suffused American history in all of its bad moments up until the present. That is where Trump came from. It's not that he was friends with Jeffrey Epstein that was the problem. It was that he was living out all these other tendencies.
Jonathan Katz, where can people find your most recent work? Where can they find your book?
So my main writing these days is in my newsletter, The Racket, which you can find at theracket.news. My books are Gangsters of Capitalism and The Big Truck That Went By, which is about the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. Subtitle of that one is How the World Came to Save Haiti and Left Behind a Disaster. Those both are still in print, so you can find them wherever books are sold. I'm working on a new book right now about fascism and free speech. Maybe I'll come back on and we'll talk about that one.
Look forward to having you on again.
Thank you.
As Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. And when I think about what we're facing now, with a twice impeached, twice indicted president leading an openly fascist movement, veterans being recruited into extremist groups, and U.S. foreign policy looking more and more like Butler's era, I hear that warning loud and clear. If we study our history, we can avoid mistakes of the past and work toward a better future. That's why conversations like this one with Jonathan Katz matter. Because if you understand Butler, you understand there's no such thing as a perfect hero. He wouldn't pass anyone's purity test, but he was a patriot. If you study what Butler did, saw, and regretted doing, you'll see that he was a complicated, principled man who was willing to change. And if you study his history, as Katz shows us in Gangsters of Capitalism, you'll see how corporate interests drive crises, how empires projecting force outwards turn in on themselves, and how the same forces that push for war abroad are often building a movement to crush democracy right at home. You also start to see who can stop it. Veterans are once again being used as pawns, but we don't have to play that role. Like Butler, we can turn around. We can organize. We can expose the plots before they're carried out. And we can make sure that the next coup attempt ends not in violence or erasure from public memory, but in historic accountability. Task Force Butler is, and always has been, a very small, completely unfunded, but very effective organization. It's a team of veterans who are ready to go on offense, using the tools of intelligence, research, and strategic action to identify threats and dismantle them before they explode. But I need to be clear. Task Force Butler and Veterans Fighting Fascism are openly anti-fascist organizations. And with Trump's executive order declaring Antifa to be a terrorist organization, which was followed by National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, and then Pam Bondi instructing the DOJ and all of the relevant agencies to crack down on Antifa, these nonprofits that I have might soon face trouble from Trump's weaponized government. That's why I started On Offense. Here and in my writing on the On Offense Substack, I can say what needs to be said. I can name names, call out fascism, and lay out the strategy on how to defeat it. Speaking out here gives me more freedom and a bit more protection than operating through a nonprofit under a weaponized federal government. And that means it's up to this community, this audience, to help to keep the pressure on. So if you felt a fire in your gut, don't let it fade. Support On Offense. Share this episode. Make sure that you subscribe to the Valor Media Network on YouTube, to On Offense on Substack, and to On Offense wherever your preferred podcast platform is. Bring others in, because we're going to need every one of us. On Offense is produced by Gina Kim as part of the Valor Media Network. If you like this episode, leave a review, hit subscribe, and to keep this work going, go to weareonoffense.com. Until next time, stay sharp, stay ready, and let's go on offense.